On the 24th of February 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation in Ukraine. Under the pretense of supporting the Russian-backed breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, the Russian army sprinted towards Kiev. 4 years later, the conflict rages on. With over 280,000 confirmed civilian and military deaths, it's been the deadliest war in Europe since World War II. It's been paradigm shifting. Matthew Slusher from the Center for Strategic and International Studies has called it a watershed moment in modern military history, fundamentally reshaping our understanding of contemporary warfare. Traditional air defense strategy has been completely overhauled. Autonomous systems have been integrated like never before, and the digital battlefield has kicked into full force, with parallel wars being fought over information and data.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine preempted the end of the rules-based international order and managed to exploit weakening US power projection in the search for a new Soviet-esque empire. The invasion of Ukraine could be understood as a watershed moment of modernity, as the first line in the next chapter of history, as the foundational act of the tripolar world. Yet echoes of the past sound through to today. A fear of direct confrontation with Russia pushes Europe and the US to the sidelines, willing to provide aid, but never troops.
Russia has made it crystal clear. NATO involvement in the war would be a red line, the crossing of which would open the floodgates of nuclear weapon use. But it's become patent that nuclear red lines are less static than we previously imagined. Since the beginning, Russia has attempted to minimize NATO intervention in the conflict through nuclear deterrence. Putin, building on decades of Cold War and post-Soviet deterrence theory, has repeatedly threatened the West with nuclear reprisals to conventional attacks, bringing the nuclear clock closer to midnight. His so-called red lines of engagement, the crossing of which would trigger unknown escalatory actions by the Russians, have repeatedly been towed and then crossed by the Western alliance. Putin's threats, however, have not materialized. A clear example took place in late 2024. On the 24th of September, Putin announced an impending update to Russia's nuclear doctrine, expanding conditions for nuclear weapon use. Specifically, the update allowed the Kremlin to use nuclear weapons in retaliation to conventional attacks that threaten Russian or Belarusian sovereignty, a significant shift from Moscow's earlier position, which only allowed nuclear engagement where the very existence of the Russian state was threatened. This move coincided with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's negotiations for greater tactical maneuverability in the war, fighting for permission to strike deep into Russian territory and destroy high-value targets. Putin's announcement was read by the defense and intelligence communities as a not-so-subtle reminder to the US. We have nuclear bombs, and we aren't afraid to use them.
Nevertheless, President Biden allowed Kiev to fire ATACMS missiles into Russia, and the British quickly followed suit, lifting similar restrictions on Storm Shadow cruise missiles. Indeed, on November 19th, 1,000 days after the start of the invasion, the Ukrainian army used US-made ATACMS missiles to strike Karachev, a Russian city over 100 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. On that same day, Putin formalized his previously announced changes to Russian nuclear doctrine.
Clearly, Biden, Zelensky, and the rest of NATO didn't believe Putin's bluff. They gambled that conventional missile attacks into Russian territory would not be enough to trigger a nuclear response, despite Putin's red lines. They were right. The Kremlin replied in kind, striking the Ukrainian city of Dnipro with an experimental, nuclear-capable IRBM, a missile with enough range to strike NATO allies in Europe. But they did not use their nuclear capabilities in this response. However, Russia's damaged nuclear posture credibility has led key thinkers in Moscow's intelligence and security circles to advocate for concrete actions that back Putin's nuclear rhetoric. Admiral Alexander Moiseyev, for one, has publicly advocated for the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons against aircraft carrier strike groups and other marine infrastructure. Such an action could restore Russian nuclear threat credibility and simultaneously de-escalate the war, at least according to the escalate to de-escalate doctrine, the E2DE. which argues for limited nuclear strikes to signal willingness to attack and to end a conflict quickly. While experts disagree on whether Russian leadership subscribes to this doctrine, Putin's desire to rebuild Russian nuclear credibility should not be undermined.
NATO's ability to ignore Russian red lines without nuclear consequences, however, should not be unduly celebrated. Understanding the discrepancies between Russia's rhetoric and its actions is not a call for increased involvement, nor is it a reason to back down. Russia's eagerness to threaten nuclear engagement and their hesitancy to act should lead to a reformulation of Europe's understanding of its aggressive neighbor.
While we might cheer on actions that contribute to the Ukrainian cause, reckless escalation by the Western Bloc, motivated by Russia's decreasing nuclear credibility, could lead to unfortunate and dangerous outcomes. It's important to remember that not all red lines are alike, and that a past hesitancy to press the big red button does not preclude it in the future.
We would also be remiss to understate the dangers of accidental nuclear catastrophes during the remainder of the war. The containment structure surrounding the highly radioactive Chernobyl nuclear reactor was hit by a combat drone in February of 2025. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, has also been at the center of a nuclear safety crisis, with recent developments including a month-long loss of external power, increasing the likelihood of a dangerous meltdown at the plant. The offensives near both power plants are part of the energy front of the Russo-Ukrainian war, and a perfect introduction to the second lesson to be learned from Ukraine, that the energy war is real, and that modern states must learn to survive it.
Russia has intensified its actions in the energy battlefield in recent months. Ukraine's electrical grid has been pieced apart by Russian military actions. Constrained by supply and distribution issues, Ukraine is struggling to meet 60% of national electricity demand, leaving Kiev and other major cities with electric and thermal blackouts for 3 to 4 hours a day, making survival in sub-zero temperatures increasingly difficult. The Kremlin's energy war was inaugurated by attacking power stations and electricity generation plants, destroying and disabling thermal and hydropower generation, concentrating electricity generation to 3 nuclear complexes. Doing so, Moscow effectively decreased the source diversity of Ukraine's electric grid, increasing the chances of a cascading failure of the 103 substations across the country that now rely nearly exclusively on nuclear power. By attacking vulnerable 750 kV and 330 kV transmission lines, the Kremlin is able to disrupt electricity distribution, multiplying the effect of their energy campaign. Moscow is playing at islanding, a strategy that aims to divide Ukraine's electric grid into isolated pockets that operate independently. This strategy is uniquely crippling in Ukraine, whose heating system is unusually centralized. Rather than having building-level heating systems, Ukraine relies on a Soviet-era model whereby central plants heat water for multiple apartment blocks. This central model means that a strike on one thermal plant can wipe out electricity and heating for hundreds of families.
The mayor of Kiev, Vital Klitschko, has said that Russian attacks on heating infrastructure have left 3,500 apartment buildings in the cold.
Blackouts in Poland have been traced to Russian-backed cyber-terrorist group Sandworm. Russia's ability to weaponize energy infrastructure and to strategically disable energy systems should worry contemporary leaders. Centralized power generation and distribution systems, like those that represent the backbone of most developed nations' energy systems, are points of vulnerability in any conflict. These are more vulnerable now than ever. Cyber attacks and drones have democratized energy disruption. They have made applying pressure on pain points dangerously simple.
The International Energy Agency has recommended decentralization as the method for rebuilding and modernizing the Ukrainian power sector. They recommend rebuilding Ukraine's power grid with an emphasis on decentralized systems, known as distributed energy resources. Beyond better resilience and increased energy security, DERs represent a cost-effective solution for rebuilding Ukraine's power system. While a DER deployment that includes renewables and batteries would be significantly more expensive than a traditional gas-based infrastructure, the IEA affirms that with the appropriate policies and regulations in place, this diverse DER scenario would reduce annual system costs by an estimated 5.6%.
DERs can also contribute to increased sustainability and a reduction of electricity's carbon footprint. Not only through the integration of local renewable energy systems, think of rooftop photovoltaic energy, wind power, and local hydropower, but also thanks to a reduction of transmission losses, which normally account for 8% of all electric generation. DERs can also empower local communities and lead to job opportunities across more local economies than centralized power plants. The rest of Europe should learn from Ukraine. Before the invasion, 40% of Europe's imported natural gas came from Russia. Germany was particularly reliant on Russian energy, building an industrial model that depended on cheap Russian gas. This centralization, this dependence on Russian gas impacted Germany massively. In short, the EU needs to prioritize energy independence to ensure the resilience, the flexibility, and the strength of European energy systems. Most EU citizens believe that there is a high risk of war with Russia. Western intelligence agencies repeatedly warned that Russia poses a serious and imminent threat to the European Union. Despite the heavy losses they've accumulated in Ukraine, Russia's armed forces still include 1.5 million active duty soldiers and 900,000 reservists. The Russian defense system also includes private military companies like the Wagner Group, which are battle-tested, having been used extensively in conflicts across the world. Troublingly, the Russian economy has recovered from international sanctions and has continued to grow through 2024 and 25, transitioning towards a war economy. Self-sufficient both in terms of agriculture and energy, and with access to markets in developing and developed economies, Russia does not seem to be slowing down anytime soon. This poses a serious threat for Europe. We can only hope that the war in Ukraine is not a test case, that Russia doesn't plan to continue expanding into Europe. But optimism alone will get us nowhere. European leaders have a duty to pay attention to what is happening, to act. We need to internalize the lessons from Ukraine, adapt our responses to Russia's nuclear threats, and establish backup, decentralized energy systems in order to ensure European independence in the face of growing Russian imperialism.